listeners, and welcome back. Today we are going to be discussing our unfiltered thoughts and opinions of Fallout Season 1. Beware of spoilers, as we will be breaking down the entire season. Also joining me today will be my brother to help us talk through and break down the key plot points. Let's begin.
So the first thing we're going to be talking about is the bomb dropping scene at the start of the series. It is such an iconic scene to begin with. Like, for years, so many people from the video games have speculated who actually dropped the bombs. And in just that opening scene, it definitively shows you that Vault-Tec were the ones that dropped the bomb, because there was no missile streams coming in when the nukes went off at the city. They all detonated at ground level, and there was multiple blasts that went off. That was my first hint. And then obviously later in the series, they literally sit down in a meeting and say that they were going to drop the bombs themselves. Fucking huge for anyone who has been playing the games.
And then even for those who haven't played the games and don't even know the significance of the backstory, it was still just a very intriguing and shocking scene to begin with, particularly just to start the show.
So then we move on to the vault system, where we meet Lucy and we start to find out what her vault is about. Being someone that come from the game, I already know that all of the vaults were set up by Vault-Tec simply for experimentation on unaware subjects for another branch of the government called the Enclave, which is basically a governing system run completely by scientists.
Whilst we're introduced to all of that, there is a massive coup, which is where we are introduced to the character Moldava, and she ends up taking Lucy's father, Hank, from the vaults into the wasteland. This is what kind of kickstarts our story, as we are following Lucy trying to track down her dad from there.
Something I find very strange about that scene, the first time you meet Moldava is when she's pretending to be someone from Vault 32, and they're doing an annual repopulation trade from Vault 32 to Vault 33. And the thing that really confused me was Hank is from before the war, knows exactly what all of the vaults are used for, and he's also an overseer, so he has access to talking to the overseers from Vault 32 and Vault 31. And yet, some reason, Hank doesn't know that Vault 32 is completely wiped out, and he also doesn't know Moldava, even though she's from 200 years before the war. So that scene, for me, has a lot of unanswered questions.
So moving on from there is, I believe, when we first meet the Ghould. So after we meet the Ghould, this is also when we're introduced to how the Goulds work and their serum system and stuff. So the Goulds are human and stuff, but they have these special serums that they need to take in order to keep them sane. And if they don't take them, they slowly lose their mind and become feral. I think they end up foreshadowing a scene where he ends up with a bunch of them that kind of symbolizes that he's able to stay sane.
One interesting thing about those serums is they actually aren't in the game. This is something they've made up completely for the show to kind of add an extra level of, storytelling. Because in the game, the nukes went off due to extreme radiation. Some people turned into ghouls, and then other people turned into feral ghouls. And ghouls are basically just humans, and their skin goes all wrinkly, and they can live for a really, really long time. Also, whenever they go near radiation, it accelerates healing. So if they've lost a finger, if they stood in a highly radioactive area, it would just regrow. But in the video games, if you get too irradiated as a ghoul, that's when it starts affecting your brain and turns you into a feral. Whereas in the TV show, they seem to have taken that element and twisted it towards the serums. So if they don't take enough of the serum throughout their life, they will just deteriorate and turn into a feral.
After that, that's when we are introduced to the Enclave and the Cold Fusion.
Now, the Enclave is a faction that is referred to multiple times in the video games. Just as a little backstory, the Enclave were founded just after the start of the Resource War in 2055. And how the faction came about was basically all of the high-ranking people in the US government came together and created a cabal of sorts and decided to use their influence and power to to essentially make their own elite society to where they could, again, then fund Vault-Tec and the world and then repopulate the world with just them. So basically it was a real Resident Evil story when it comes to the Enclave.
And then as for like the cold fusion, that's essentially like endless energy.
Cold fusion is never actually mentioned in the video games. There's nothing stating that, specifically cold fusion that will be endless energy. It's just nuclear reactors in the game. In the TV show, they are basically trying to symbolize that cold fusion is an extremely small device that can create exceptionally large amount of power. They could basically power the entire continental United States with just one tiny little tablet-sized cold fusion core. After that is when we meet Maximus and are introduced to the Brotherhood of Steel.
He's able to go out on his first exhibition. Whilst there, they end up doing like a bit of a side mission, and the dude that he's with gets attacked. And so Maximus decides you did this to yourself. So he ends up taking the steel, and he knows that he needs something to present to the Brotherhood before he comes back. So this is where he hears about the cold fusion, and he goes on his own journey to also track it down to be able to trade with the Brotherhood.
So Max and Lucy, they are the two main love interests of the show, and personally I really like their dynamic between a good guy that's had to grow up in a terrible world and is now faced with a good girl who grew up in a good world and is now faced with a terrible world, and the way that their dynamics kind of clash.
Yeah, I liked Max and Lucy's dynamic as well. Whilst they're together, this is where we also are introduced to Shady Sands, and we find out that this is where Max actually came from.
The interesting thing about Shady Sands is it has a really rich backstory when it comes to the game. Shady Sands was actually this really small, walled-in town in the very first game, and then in the second game, it turned into a more built-up, more fortified walled town, and that's where the NCR originally comes from.
This is where we also realize that Hank is responsible for Shady Sands. He is the one that put the bomb there and set it off and killed everyone that was in Shady Sands.
The one thing that really confuses me about Shady Sands is Moldava. Somehow, in the storyline, she was around before the war and is still around after the war, 200 years later. And she had to have come back into the storyline after the war early enough to become an influential member of Shady Sands, plus stick around 20 years after the destruction of Shady Sands to be able to tell Lucy the story of how she met her mum.
Now going back to Norm's and the vault, he is starting to get more and more suspicious about what happened to his vault and what happened to Vault 32. So this is where he starts looking into it, and what he finds is quite disturbing.
He's finding corpses all throughout the whole vault and writing on the wall saying that they're liars and deceivers, and it all leads back to the entryway to Vault 31. And now that Norm is suspicious, he ends up investigating further into Vault 31. He finds out that it's actually a cryogenic stasis for people from before the war called Buds. And he also finds out that his own father, Hank McLean, and Betty and Steph are all from before the war.
These are Bud's buds. My buds. America outsourced the survival of this country to the private sector.
Now, last but certainly not least, we got to talk about the Gould. We've touched on him a little bit already, and the fun fact about him is that the Gould that we are following is actually the cowboy that we see from the very first scene in episode 1 when the bombs drop. Now, because of this, as we follow his story, we get little snippets of him in the wasteland, and then we also get his story of the past leading up to the bombs dropping. So what we learn from his story in the past is that his wife is actually a member of Vault-Tec, and quite a significant and influential member of Vault-Tec. We find out that he was also a part of Vault-Tec's campaign when it came to the vaults. He was the main face of the advertisements when it came to promoting the vaults for Vault-Tec. It is due to all of this that is why Moldava ends up getting involved with him in the past. She connects with him and introduces that she was the one that ended up creating cold fusion. It was stolen from her and used within Vault-Tec, and it's basically where she's just trying to get him to see that the company that he's working for and that maybe even his wife are not the people that he first assumed. This is why she gives him the earpiece, and how he is able to listen into the final meeting about them talking about the ending the world. That is sort of all we know of his story coming into season 1. Now when we're watching him as a Gould in the wasteland, he's on the mission to look for his family. The only connection that he possibly has is with Moldava and Lucy. When he meets Lucy, he figures out that her last name is McLean and sees the connection there, as he actually knows Hank. He then eventually comes across a photo of Moldava and realizes who she really is and puts that together as well. This is what leads him to the observatory, and it all comes to a head there. He is confronted with Hank, where he asks the question, where is his family, not where is his wife. So from the first scene that we see when the bombs drop, he is with his daughter. So you're thinking most of this time that he's possibly looking for his wife because she would have been in the vaults. But at the very end is where he actually specifically says family. So this is where you clue on to the fact that the daughter is still alive, which kind of gives you more questions than it does answers, because you're wondering, how did the daughter end up in the vaults even though she was with him when the bombs actually dropped? And if the daughter was able to get into a vault with the wife, why isn't the Gould also in the vaults with his family? Like, what happened to cause his daughter to get into one but him be left out? Hank does not answer the question and instead ends up escaping and making his way to New Vegas. This is what sets us on the path for season 2.
Well, that is all for this episode. Let us know what some of your thoughts and opinions are, and if we left anything out of season 1.
And what are some of your expectations and thoughts coming into season 2?
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.